All right, today we're reading Anne of Green Gables, chapter 29, an epic in Anne's life. 네, an epic means 중요한 사건 or 변화, 사건 혹은 변화가 일어나는 시대. All right, 가보겠습니다. Anne was bringing the cows home from the back pasture by way of Lover's Lane. It was a September evening, and all the gaps and clearings in the woods were brimmed up with ruby sunset light. Here and there, the lane was splashed with it, but for the most part, it was already quite shadowy beneath the maples, and the spaces under the firs were filled with a clear, violet dusk like airy wine. The winds were out in their tops, and there is no sweeter music on earth than that which the wind makes in the fir trees at evening. The cows swung placidly down the lane, and Anne followed them dreamily, repeating aloud the battle canto from Marmion, which had also been part of their English course the preceding winter, and which Miss Stacy had made them learn off by heart, and exulting in its rushing lines and the clash of spears in its imagery. When she came to the lines, the stubborn spearsmen still made good their dark, impenetrable wood. She stopped in ecstasy to shut her eyes, that she might the better fancy herself one of that heroic ring. When she opened them again, it was to behold Diana coming through the gate that led into the berry field, and looking so important that Anne instantly divined there was news to be told. But betrayed too eager curiosity, she would not. 네, 여기서 divine은 뭘 예측하다라는 뜻이죠. 여기 마지막 읽은 문장이 but betray too eager curiosity she would not. 이거를 사실은 이런 순서로 말을 하지 않죠. 주로 she would not betray but she would not betray too eager a curiosity. 이렇게 하게 할 텐데 여기서는 강조를 하고 싶은 거는 she가 아니라 betray 안 하겠다. 뭐를? 너무 궁금한 거를. 왜냐? 다이아나가 너무 중요한 뉴스를 가지고 있다는 것처럼 생겼어요, 표정이. Isn't this evening just like a purple dream, Diana? It makes me so glad to be alive. In the mornings, I always think the mornings are best, but when evening comes, I think it's lovelier still. It's a very fine evening, said Diana, but oh, I have such news, Anne. Guess. You can have 3 guesses. 아주 신나는 소식이 있대요. 3번 알아맞추는 거, guess, 알아맞혀보래요. 3번. Charlotte Gillis is going to be married in the church after all, and Mrs. Allen wants us to decorate it, cried Anne. 네, cried라고 했으니까 다시 읽어봐야겠네요. Charlotte Gillis is going to be married in the church after all, and Mrs. Allen wants us to decorate it, cried Anne. No, Charlotte's beau won't agree to that because nobody ever has been married in the church yet, and he thinks it would seem too much like a funeral. It's too mean because it would be such fun. Guess again. Jane's mother is going to let her have a birthday party? Diana shook her head, her black eyes dancing with merriment. I can't think what it can be, said Anne in despair, unless it's that Moody Spurgeon Macpherson saw you home from prayer meeting last night. Did he? 혹시 무디가 이제 나는 못 알아맞추겠어. Unless 무디가 어제 바래다 줬어 집에? 그랬더니 I should think not, exclaimed Diana indignantly. 네. 불쾌하는? I wrote 분개하는. I wrote Korean here, but I couldn't read my own writing. 네. 너무 싫어한다는 거죠. I wouldn't be likely to boast of it if he did, the horrid creature. 그랬다 해도 나는 그거에 대해서 자랑은 안 하겠지. I knew you couldn't guess it. Mother had a letter from Aunt Josephine today, and Aunt Josephine wants you and me to go to town next Tuesday and stop with her for the exhibition. There! 네, Aunt Josephine이 초대했다는 거죠. Oh, Diana, whispered Anne, finding it necessary to lean up against a maple tree for support. Do you really mean it? But I'm afraid Marilla won't let me go. She will say that she can't encourage gadding about. gadding about는 쏘다니다, 나다니다, 막 여기저기, right? That was what she said last week when Jane invited me to go with them in their double-seated buggy to the American concert at the White Sands Hotel. I wanted to go, but Marilla said I'd be better at home learning my lessons, and so would Jane. I was bitterly disappointed, Diana. I felt so heartbroken that I wouldn't say my prayers when I went to bed. But I repented of that and got up in the middle of the night and said them. 너무 마음이 썩어서 기도도 못했대요. 그런데 너무 또 후회스러워가지고 새벽에 일어나서 다시 기도를 했대요. I'll tell you, said Diana. We'll get Mother to ask Marilla. She'll be more likely to let you go then. And if she does, we'll have the time of our lives, Anne. I've never been to an exhibition, and it's so aggravating to hear the other girls talking about their trips. Jane and Ruby have been twice, and they're going this year again. I'm not going to think about it at all until I know whether I can go or not, said Anne resolutely. If I did and then was disappointed, it would be more than I could bear. But in case I do go, I'm very glad my new coat will be ready by that time. Marilla didn't think I needed a new coat. She said my old one would do very well for another winter and that I ought to be satisfied with having a new dress. 네. 못 갈 수도 있으니까 나는 그거에 대해서 생각을 안 할 거야. 하지만 혹시라도 가게 된다면 내 새로운 코트가 준비가 돼 있을 거야. She said that hold on. The dress is very pretty, Diana. Navy blue and made so fashionably. Marilla always makes my dresses fashionably now because she says she doesn't intend to have Matthew going to Mrs. Lynde to make them. 네, 이제는 전에는 항상 촌스럽게 만들었었잖아요. 그죠? 하지만 이제는 Marilla가 Anne의 드레스를 항상 옷을 세련되게 만든대요. 왜냐하면 Matthew가 Mrs. Lynde에게 또 부탁할까 봐. I'm so glad. It is ever so much easier to be good if your clothes are fashionable. At least it is easier for me. I suppose it doesn't make such a difference to naturally good people. 옷이 세련되면 훨씬 선하기가 쉽대요. But Matthew said I must have a new coat, so Marilla bought a lovely piece of blue broadcloth, and it's being made by a real dressmaker over at Carmody. It's to be done Saturday night, and I'm trying not to imagine myself walking up the church aisle on Sunday in my new suit and cap, because I'm afraid it isn't right to imagine such things. But it just slips into my mind in spite of me. My cap is so pretty. Matthew bought it for me the day we were over at Carmody. It is one of those little blue velvet ones that are all the rage. 완전히 유행인, 완전히 핫한, with gold cord and tassels. Your new hat is elegant, Diana, and so becoming. Becoming은 너에게 너무 잘 어울려. When I saw you come into church last Sunday, my heart swelled with pride to think you were my dearest friend. 너무 자랑스러웠어. 너가 나의 가장 친한 벗이라고 생각하니까 너무 자랑스러워서. Do you suppose it's wrong for us to think so much about our clothes? Marilla says it is very sinful, but it is such an interesting subject, isn't it? Marilla agreed to let Anne go to town, and it was arranged that Mr. Barry should take the girls in on the following Tuesday. As Charlottetown was 30 miles away, and Mr. Barry wished to go and return the same day, it was necessary to make a very early start. But Anne counted it all joy and was up before sunrise on Tuesday morning. 네, 여기를 counted it all joy. 이거는 but Anne considered it all joy. 이 말을 considered를 counted라고 이렇게 말을 했네요. I don't know if it's because it's an old book. 네, 새벽에 일어나도 다 너무 즐거웠다는 거죠. A glance from her window assured her that the day would be fine, for the eastern sky behind the firs of the haunted wood was all silvery and cloudless. Through the gap in the trees, a light was shining in the western gable of Orchard Slope, a token that Diana was also up. A token, 힌트라는 뜻이죠. 그러니까 gap in the trees, 나무 사이에 불이 켜져 있었어요. 그러니까 다이아나도 역시 일어났다는 뜻이었다는 거죠. Anne was dressed by the time Matthew had the fire on and had the breakfast ready when Marilla came down, but for her own part was much too excited to eat. After breakfast, the jaunty new cap and jacket were donned, and Anne hastened over the brook and up through the firs to Orchard Slope. Mr. Barry and Diana were waiting for her, and they were soon on the road. It was a long drive, but Anne and Diana enjoyed every minute of it. It was delightful to rattle along over the moist roads in the early red sunlight that was creeping across the shorn harvest fields. The air was fresh and crisp, and little smoke blue mists curled through the valleys and floated off from the hills. 네, 안녕하세요. 감사합니다. Sometimes the road went through woods where maples were beginning to hang out scarlet banners. Sometimes it crossed rivers on bridges that made Anne's flesh cringe with the old, half-delightful fear. Sometimes it wound along a harbor shore and passed by a little cluster of weather-gray fishing huts. Again, it mounted to hills whence a far sweep of curving upland or misty blue sky could be seen. But wherever it went, there was much of interest to discuss. It was almost noon when they reached town and found their way to Beechwood. It was quite a fine old mansion, set back from the street in a seclusion of green elms and branching beeches. Miss Barry met them at the door with a twinkle in her sharp black eyes. "So you've come to see me at last, you Anne girl," she said. "Mercy, child, how you have grown! You're taller than I am, I declare, and you're ever so much better looking than you used to be, too. But I dare say you know that without being told." 네, 앤 조세핀이 뭐라 그런 거죠? 엄청 컸네. 나보다도 더 컸어. 그리고 전에보다 훨씬 예뻐졌네. 더 잘생겨졌네. 그런데 내가 얘기 안 해줘도 너 알고 있지? "Indeed I didn't," said Anne radiantly. 나 정말 몰랐어요. "I know I'm not so freckled as I used to be, so I've much to be thankful for, but I really hadn't dared to hope there was any other improvement. I'm so glad you think there is, Miss Barry." 나의 주근깨가 옅어진 거는 알았지만, 옅어졌지만 그 이상의 발전은 있을 거라고 내가 희망도 못했는데 감사합니다. 그렇게 더 잘생겨졌다고 해서 너무 기쁩니다. Miss Barry's house was furnished with great magnificence, as Anne told Marilla afterwards. The two little country girls were rather abashed by the splendor of the parlor, where Miss Barry left them when she went to see about dinner. "Isn't it just like a palace?" whispered Diana. "I never was in Aunt Josephine's house before, and I'd no idea it was so grand. I just wish Julia Bell could see this. She puts on such airs about her mother's parlor." 네, puts on airs 혹은 puts on such airs는 엄청 잘난 척한다는 뜻이죠. "Velvet carpet," sighed Anne luxuriously, "and silk curtains. I've dreamed of such things, Diana. But do you know I don't believe I feel very comfortable with them after all. There are so many things in this room and all so splendid that there is no scope for imagination. 너무 멋진 것들이 많아서 상상력을 발휘할 구멍이 없어. That is one consolation when you are poor. There are so many more things you can imagine about. 가난해도 위로가 되는 한 가지는 훨씬 더 많은 것에 대해 상상을 할 수 있다. Their sojourn in town was something that Anne and Diana dated from for years. From first to last, it was crowded with delights. 네, 여기서 their sojourn in town was something that Anne and Diana dated from for years. 몇 년 동안 그들의 타운에 있었던 체류를 그때 1년 전에 우리 거기 있었을 때 혹은 그게 2년 전이었지 혹은 6개월 전에 우리 했었잖아. 거기서부터 이제 뭐가 시작됐다는 뜻이에요. 거기서부터 이제 계산을 하기 시작했다는 거예요. On Wednesday, 네, 그만큼 중요했다는 뜻이죠. Anne과 Diana에게. On Wednesday, Miss Barry took them to the exhibition grounds and kept them there all day. It was splendid, Anne related to Marilla later on. I never imagined anything so interesting. I don't really know which department was the most interesting. I think I liked the horses and the flowers and the fancy work best. Josie Pye took first prize for knitted lace. I was real glad she did, and I was glad that I felt glad, for it shows I'm improving, don't you think, Marilla, when I can rejoice in Josie's success? 네, 조지가 뜨개 레이스를 상을 1등 상을 받았대요. 그래서 되게 기뻤는데 기뻤다는 거에 대해서 기뻤대요. 왜냐하면 자기가 조지를 되게 원래 미워했는데 조지의 성공에 대해서 자기가 기뻐할 수 있는 거는 자기가 그만큼 발전했다는 뜻이 아니겠어요. 네, 이렇게 막 Marilla가 얘기한 거죠. 로미님 안녕하세요. Mr. Harmon Andrews took second prize for Gravenstein apples, and Mr. Bell took first prize for a pig. Diana said she thought it was ridiculous for a Sunday school superintendent to take a prize in pigs, but I don't see why. Do you? She said she would always think of it after this when he was praying so solemnly. Clara Louise McPherson took a prize for painting, and Mrs. Lynde got first prize for homemade butter and cheese. So Avonlea was pretty well represented, wasn't it? Mrs. Lynde was there that day, and I never knew how much I really liked her until I saw her familiar face among all those strangers. Mrs. Lynde가 거기에 있었는데 내가 Mrs. Lynde를 얼마나 좋아하는지 내가 그날 알게 됐다. 전혀 몰랐었다. 언제까지? 그녀의 familiar, 알고 있는 얼굴을 Oh my goodness. 한국말이랑 영어 순서가 너무 달라가지고 this is so difficult. Okay. Strangers. 낯선 사람들 중에 그녀의 familiar face를 보니깐 그때 알게 됐어. 내가 얼마나 Mrs. Linde를 좋아하는 거였는지. 내 그전엔 몰랐거든. There were thousands of people there, Marilla. It made me feel dreadfully insignificant. And Miss Barry took us up to the grandstand to see the horse races. Mrs. Lynde wouldn't go. She said horse racing was an abomination, and she, being a church member, thought it her bounden duty to set a good example by staying away. But there were so many there, I don't believe Mrs. Lynde's absence would ever be noticed. I don't think, though, that I ought to go very often to horse races, because they are awfully fascinating. 네. What is a horse race? 말 경기? I feel like there's a better word for this. 네. 말 경기를 가 너무 재밌어서 네, 자기는 안 가는 게 낫겠대요. 왜냐하면 거기서 이제 내기를 하니까. Diana got so excited that she offered to bet me 10 cents that the red horse would win. I didn't believe he would, but I refused to bet because I wanted to tell Mrs. Allen all about everything, and I felt sure it wouldn't do to tell her that. 다이아나는 빨간 말이 이길 거라고 해서 내기하자 그랬는데 나는 안 이길 거라고 생각했지만 그래도 나는 내기 안 하기로 했다. 안 했어요. 왜냐하면 미세스 앨런드에게 모든 것을 얘기를 해줘야 되는데 하고 싶은데 내기하면은 그거에 대해서는 얘기할 수가 없으니까. It's always wrong to do anything you can't tell the minister's wife. 목사의 아내에게 얘기해 줄 수 없는 거는 항상 잘못된 거야. 경마. 네, thank you. I knew there was a better word for it. It's as good as an extra conscience to have a minister's wife for your friend. 또 하나의 양심 있는 거랑 똑같아. 뭐가? 목사의 아내가 너의 친구로 있는 게. And I was very glad I didn't bet because the red horse did win and I would have lost 10 cents. So you see that virtue was its own reward. We saw a man go up in a balloon. I'd love to go up in a balloon, Marilla. It would be simply thrilling. And we saw a man selling fortunes. You paid him 10 cents and a little bird picked out your fortune for you. What is a fortune? Fortune teller. Like 타로처럼 미래를 알려주는. Miss Barry gave Diana and me 10 cents each to have our fortunes told. Mine was that I would marry a dark-complected man who was very wealthy and I would go across water to live. 네. 뭐라고 얘기를 해줬나요? 미래의 complected는 이제 피부를 얘기를 하는 거죠. complexion. 그런데 원래는 dark complexioned man 이렇게 해야 되는데 complected도 네, 틀리진 않습니다. 네, 그러니까 피부가 조금 검은 사람 그리고 아주 돈이 많은 그리고 물을 건너서 살 거라고 미래에. I looked carefully at all the dark men I saw after that, but I didn't care much for any of them. And anyhow, I suppose it's too early to be looking out for him yet. Oh, it was a never-to-be-forgotten day, Marilla. I was so tired I couldn't sleep at night. 너무 피곤해서 잠을 못 잤대요. Miss Barry put us up Miss Barry put us in the spare room according to promise. It was an elegant room, Marilla, but somehow sleeping in a spare room isn't what I used to think it was. That's the worst of growing up, and I'm beginning to realize it. The things you wanted so much when you were a child don't seem half so wonderful to you when you get them. 네, 점쟁이. 네, 점쟁이가 점을 봐주는 거죠. Fortune. Thursday, the girls had a drive in the park, and in the evening, Miss Barry took them to a concert in the Academy of Music, where a noted prima donna was to sing. To Anne, the evening was a glittering vision of delight. Oh, Marilla, it was beyond description. I was so excited I couldn't even talk, so you may know what it was like. I just sat in enraptured silence. Madame Selitsky was perfectly beautiful and wore white satin and diamonds, but when she began to sing, I never thought about anything else. Oh, I can't tell you how I felt, but it seemed to me that it could never be hard to get 다시 해볼게요. But it seemed to me that it could never be hard to be good anymore. I felt like I do when I look up to the stars. Tears came into my eyes, but oh, they were such happy tears. I was so sorry when it was all over, and I told Miss Barry I didn't see how I was ever to return to common life again. She said she thought if we went over to the restaurant across the street and had an ice cream, it might help me. 네, 어떻게 정상 삶을 다시 살 수 있을지 모르겠다고 했더니 그러면은 건너편에 식당 가서 아이스크림을 먹으면 이제 도움이 되겠다고 했대요. That sounded so prosaic. But to my surprise, I found it true. 네, 너무 평범하고 상상력이 없는 말처럼 들렸지만 사실이었다는 걸 느꼈어요. The ice cream was delicious, Marilla, and it was so lovely and dissipated to be sitting there eating it at 11 o'clock at night. Diana said she believed she was born for city life. Miss Barry asked me what my opinion was, but I said I would have to think it over very seriously before I could tell her what I really thought. So I thought it over after I went to bed. That is the best time to think things out. And I came to the conclusion, Marilla, that I wasn't born for city life and that I was glad of it. 자기는 도시녀가 아니라는 거죠. It's nice to be eating ice cream at brilliant restaurants at 11 o'clock at night once in a while, but as a regular thing, I'd rather be in the East Gable at 11, sound asleep, but kind of knowing even in my sleep that the stars were shining outside and the wind was blowing in the firs across the brook. I told Miss Barry so at breakfast the next morning, and she laughed. 네, 어쩌다가 한 번씩 이렇게 도시 가서 신나게 지내는 것도 좋지만 자기는 그냥 일찍 자고 자기 집에서 자고 자연에 둘러싸여서 사는 게 더 좋다 그랬죠. Miss Barry generally laughed at anything I said, even when I said the most solemn things. 되게 심각한 말을 해도 Miss Barry는 내가 말한 거 거의 모든 거에 웃었다. I don't think I liked it, Marilla, because I wasn't trying to be funny. 내가 웃기려고 한 것도 아닌데 웃어가지고 그렇게 좋지는 않았어요. But she is a most hospitable lady and treated us royally. Friday brought going home time, and Mr. Barry drove in for the girls. Well, I hope you've enjoyed yourselves, said Miss Barry. 다시 한번 해볼게요. Well, I hope you've enjoyed yourself, said Miss Barry as she bade them goodbye. Indeed we have, said Diana. And you, Anne girl? I've enjoyed every minute of the time, said Anne, throwing her arms impulsively about the old woman's neck and kissing her wrinkled cheek. Diana would never have dared to do such a thing and felt rather aghast at Anne's freedom. But Miss Barry was pleased, and she stood on her veranda and watched the buggy out of sight. Then she went back into her big house with a sigh. It seemed very lonely, lacking those fresh young lives. Miss Barry was a rather selfish old lady, if the truth must be told, and had never cared much for anybody but herself. She valued people only as they were of service to her or amused her. Anne had amused her, and consequently stood high in the old lady's good graces. But Miss Barry found herself thinking less about Anne's quaint speeches than of her fresh enthusiasms, her transparent emotions, her little winning ways, and the sweetness of her eyes and lips. 네, 미스 베리가 앤을 왜 좋아한다고요? 그녀가 말을 되게 웃기게 하지만 그것보다도 fresh enthusiasms. 그러니까 모든 것들이 다 너무 즐거워하고 새로워하고 신나하니까. 그리고 숨기지 않는 감정들. 그리고 그냥 되게 charming하다는 거죠. I thought Marilla Cuthbert was an old fool when I heard she'd adopted a girl out of an orphan asylum, she said to herself. But I guess she didn't make much of a mistake after all. If I'd a child like Anne in the house all the time, I'd be a better and happier woman. Marilla가 여자아이를 고아를 입양했다고 들었을 때, 정말 실수를 했네 생각했지만 지금 보니까 실수가 아니었네. 나도 앤 같은 아이가 항상 집에 있더라면 훨씬 좋고 좋은 사람, 그리고 더 행복한 여자였을 거야. Anne and Diana found the drive home as pleasant as the drive in. Pleasanter indeed, since there was the delightful consciousness of home waiting at the end of it. It was sunset when they passed through White Sands and turned into the shore road. Beyond, the Avonlea hills came out darkly against the saffron sky. Behind them, the moon was rising out of the sea that grew all radiant and transfigured in her light. Every little cove along the curving road was a marvel of dancing ripples. The waves broke with a soft swish on the rocks below them, and the tang of the sea was in the strong, fresh air. Oh, but it's good to be alive and to be going home, breathed Anne. When she crossed the log bridge over the brook, the kitchen light of Green Gables winked her a friendly welcome back, and through the open door shone the hearth fire, sending out its warm, red glow athwart the chilly autumn night. Anne ran blithely up the hill and into the kitchen, where a hot supper was waiting on the table. Ran blithely up, 태평스럽게 뛰어 올라갔다는 거죠. So you've got back, said Marilla, folding up her knitting. 네, 이 말은 문법적으로 맞지 않죠. So you've come back 혹은 you've gotten back. 네, 아무튼 이렇게 말을 잘 안 해요, 요즘에는. Yes, and oh, it's so good to be back, said Anne joyously. I could kiss everything, even to the clock, Marilla. Even to the clock. Marilla, a broiled chicken. You don't mean to say you cooked that for me? Yes, I did, said Marilla. I thought you'd be hungry after such a drive and need something real appetizing. Hurry and take off your things, and we'll have supper as soon as Matthew comes in. I'm glad you've got back, I must say. It's been fearful lonesome here without you, and I never put in 4 longer days. 이렇게 긴 나흘은 처음 느껴봤다. After supper, Anne sat before the fire between Matthew and Marilla and gave them a full account of her visit. I've had a splendid time, she concluded happily, and I feel that it marks an epoch in my life. But the best of it all was the coming home. 네, 너무 좋은 시간이었지만 가장 좋았던 부분은 집에 돌아오는 것이었대요. All right, that was a pretty long chapter. Thank you for staying with me. Next, we're going to be reading chapter 30. Oh my goodness, we are almost finished. Any questions or comments? Let's see what the last chapter is. Chapter 38가 마지막이에요. So we have, is it 8 more weeks? 30, 31? Yeah, 8 more weeks. And then we're going to be finished. 맞아요. 나흘이나 없으니까. 근데 Aunt Josephine은 항상 집이 비어 있었다가 나흘만 같이 있었던 거잖아요. 그러니까 Miss Barry는 훨씬 돈도 많고 더 나은 상황이지만 네, 훨씬 더 불쌍한 거죠. Marilla보다. Purple Dream이 어디 있었을까요? 네, 표현은 없는 것 같아요. 네, 표현이 없는 것 같아요, 따로. All right, thank you for staying. I will see you again next week, hopefully. Have a good evening. Good night.